Hi, thanks for visiting Bible Mountain. This is the 16th lesson in a series of lessons in the book of Jude. In this lesson, I'm going to look at verse 11 and talk about the rebellion of Korah. In verse 11, the last four words are the rebellion of Korah. There are actually three people in the Bible who are named Korah. In this lesson, I'm going to take a brief look at these men named Korah to figure out who Jude was talking about. Then we're going to look at number 16, which tells us about the rebellion of Korah. And then we'll talk in general terms about what the Bible overall has to say about rebellion, particularly rebellion against God. Then we'll take a look at the book of Jude and see what Jude has to say about the rebellion of Korah. Then we'll take a look at what rebellion against God looks like in our culture, particularly in our churches. So this is a computer program called Accordance. I did a concordance search for the word Korah, and this name is used 40 times throughout the Bible. In Genesis, Korah refers to a descendant of Esau. Then you get down to Exodus, Korah refers to a descendant of Levi. Then also number 16 is where we read about the rebellion of Korah, and we also see that Korah was the descendant of Levi. In 1 Chronicles 1, we see a reference to Korah. That was the descendant of Esau. 1 Chronicles 2, we see a reference to Korah. That was a descendant of the tribe of Judah. And then 1 Chronicles 6, Korah is a reference to the descendant of Levi. And throughout the rest of the Bible, any reference to Korah is the descendant of Levi. Many of the Psalms were written by the sons of Korah. And that person, that Korah, is the same person who was involved in the rebellion of Korah. In the New Testament, the name Korah appears once, and that is the verse that we're looking at in this lesson. Let's take a look at a timeline and a map. At the beginning of the Bible, we read about Adam. He lived roughly 4000 BC. And we read about Noah and the flood, which was roughly 2500 BC. And then we read about Abram. He lived roughly 2000 BC. So what we know about Abram is he had a son named Isaac. Isaac had a son named Jacob. And then Jacob had 12 sons. And those are listed for us in Genesis 29 through 30. In Genesis 41, we learn that Joseph had two sons, Ephraim and Manasseh. And then in Genesis 48, we read that Jacob, towards the end of his life, went to bless Joseph, and Jacob claimed Joseph's two sons as his own sons. So that meant there were now 13 men who were considered to be the descendants of Jacob. Now, as you know, we always refer to the 12 tribes of Israel. So if Jacob had 13 sons, how were there only 12 tribes? The answer to that is found in Numbers 18. What that tells us is that Levi did not receive an inheritance of land like the other brothers did because they were the priestly tribe. And so throughout the Bible, when you see a list of the 12 tribes of Israel who settled the Promised Land, Levi and Joseph are not listed as one of the tribes. Instead, we have Ephraim and Manasseh. So as I said, Abram, Isaac, and Jacob lived roughly 2000 BC. And we get to the book of Exodus. The events in Exodus happened roughly 1500 BC. At the beginning of the book of Exodus, the Israelites were in Egypt. They were in slavery. And we read that Moses led them out of slavery into the wilderness to Mount Sinai, where he gave them the Mosaic Law. Once they were done receiving the law, we had the book of Numbers, and the Israelites were told to enter the Promised Land. So they went up to Kadesh Barnea, they sent spies into the Promised Land, but then the Israelites turned against Moses. They believed that they were not strong enough to conquer the Promised Land, and so God told them that they had to wander in the wilderness for 40 years. It was shortly after that we have the rebellion of Korah, as recorded in Numbers 16. So let's start reading Numbers 16, the rebellion of Korah. Now Korah, the son of Izhar, the son of Kohath, the son of Levi, with Dathan and Abiram, the sons of Eliab, and On, the son of Peleth, sons of Reuben, took action, and they rose up before Moses, together with some of the sons of Israel, 250 leaders of the congregation, chosen in the assembly, men of renown. So let's take a look at this. First, we see that Korah rose up. Korah was a son of Levi, but he was joined by Dathan and Abiram and On. They were all sons of Reuben. In addition to them, we also see there were 250 leaders, and these leaders were called men of renown. So this was a very serious rebellion. Now let's go back to our genealogy. As you know, Moses was a leader of the Israelites. Moses was a descendant of Levi. Korah was one of the men who rebelled. He was also a descendant of Levi. Then the other leaders of the rebellion were Dathan, Abiram, and On. They were descendants of Reuben. Now Reuben was the firstborn, so in some ways it made sense that people in the tribe of Reuben felt that somebody from Reuben should be the leader of the Israelites. But as you know, God had appointed Moses as the leader of Israel, and he was from the tribe of Levi. Let's keep reading at verse 3. They assembled together against Moses and Aaron and said to them, "You have gone far enough, for all the congregation are holy, every one of them, and the Lord is in their midst. So why do you exalt yourselves above the assembly of the Lord?" So these men, Korah and those with him, accused Moses of exalting himself. But that wasn't true. God is the one who had appointed Moses as the leader. Let's keep going to verse 4. When Moses heard this, he fell on his face, and he spoke to Korah and all his company, saying, "Tomorrow morning the Lord will show who is his and who is holy, and will bring him near to himself, even the one whom he will choose. He will bring near to himself. Do this, take censers for yourselves, Korah and all your company, and put fire in them, and lay incense upon them in the presence of the Lord tomorrow. And the man whom the Lord chooses shall be the one who is holy. You have gone far enough, you sons of Levi." Then Moses said to Korah, "Hear now, you sons of Levi, is it not enough for you that the God of Israel has separated you from the rest of the congregation of Israel, to bring you near to himself, to do the service of the tabernacle of the Lord, and to stand before the congregation to minister to them, and that he has brought you near, Korah, and all your brothers, sons of Levi, with you? And are you seeking for the priesthood also? Therefore you and all your company are gathered together against the Lord, but as for Aaron, who is he that you grumble against him?" Now notice the word enough. Moses asked Korah, "Is it not enough that God separated you and put you in charge of the service of the tabernacle?" And so we see that Korah was not satisfied with what he had. He wanted more, and that caused problems for him. That led him to sin. Notice also that Moses pointed out very correctly that these men were actually rebelling against Yahweh. They made it sound like they were rebelling against Moses, but Moses had been appointed by Yahweh, therefore they were really rebelling against Yahweh. Let's continue reading at verse 12. Then Moses sent a summons to Dathan and Abiram, the sons of Eliab, but they said, "We will not come up. Is it not enough that you have brought us up out of a land flowing with milk and honey to have us die in the wilderness? But you would also lord it over us? Indeed, you have not brought us into a land flowing with milk and honey, nor have you given us an inheritance of fields and vineyards. Would you put out the eyes of these men? We will not come up." Now in this case, Dathan and Abiram pointed out something that was true. At this point, Moses had not brought them into a land flowing with milk and honey. That had been the promise back in Egypt. Now, it was not Moses' fault. Nevertheless, it was true that at this point they had not entered yet a land flowing with milk and honey. Verse 15. Then Moses became very angry and said to the Lord, "Do not regard their offering. I have not taken a single donkey from them, nor have I done harm to any of them." Moses spoke to Korah, "You and all your company be present before the Lord tomorrow, both you and they, along with Aaron. Each of you take his fire pan and put incense on it, and each of you bring a censer before the Lord, 250 fire pans. Also you and Aaron shall each bring his fire pan." So they each took his own censer and put fire on it, and laid incense on it, and they stood at the doorway of the tent of meeting with Moses and Aaron. Thus Korah assembled all the congregation against them at the doorway of the tent of meeting, and the glory of the Lord appeared to all the congregation. Then the Lord spoke to Moses and Aaron, saying, "Separate yourselves from among this congregation, that I may consume them instantly." But they fell on their faces and said, "O God, God of the spirits of all flesh, when one man sins, will you be angry with the entire congregation?" Then the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "Speak to the congregation, saying, Get back from around the dwellings of Korah, Dathan, and Abiram." And Moses arose and went to Dathan and Abiram with the elders of Israel following him. And he spoke to the congregation, saying, "Depart now from the tents of these wicked men, and touch nothing that belongs to them, or you will be swept away in all their sin." So they got back from around the dwellings of Korah, Dathan, and Abiram, and Dathan and Abiram came out and stood at the doorway of their tents, along with their wives and their sons and their little ones. Moses said, "By this you shall know that the Lord has sent me to do all these deeds, for this is not my doing. If these men die the death of all men, or if they suffer the fate of all men, then the Lord has not sent me. But if the Lord brings about an entirely new thing, and the ground opens its mouth and swallows them up with all that is theirs, and they descend alive into Sheol, then you will understand that these men have spurned the Lord. So Moses made it clear here that what was about to happen was going to prove that God had sent Moses. Notice also the word spurned. Moses made it very clear that these men were not spurning Moses or Aaron. They were actually spurning Yahweh. Let's keep reading at verse 31. As he finished speaking all these words, the ground that was under them split open, and the earth opened its mouth and swallowed them up and their households, and all the men who belonged to Korah with their possessions. So they and all that belonged to them went down alive to Sheol, and the earth closed over them, and they perished from the midst of the assembly. All Israel who were around them fled at their outcry, for they said, "The earth may swallow us up." Fire also came forth from the Lord and consumed the 250 men who were offering the incense. So that is a story of Korah. So what happened next that is recorded in the book of Numbers is the Israelites went back out into the wilderness. They wandered around for 40 years. And towards the end of the 40 years, it was time for them to enter the promised land. So they traveled up on the east side of Edom and Moab, and then they traveled through Ammon, and they arrived on the east side of the Jordan River. At that point, Moses reviewed with the Israelites their history and their law, and that's recorded in the book of Deuteronomy. And we have this interesting verse in Deuteronomy 9, verse 7. Remember, do not forget how you provoked the Lord your God to wrath in the wilderness from the day that you left the land of Egypt until you arrived at this place. You have been rebellious against the Lord. So we see the word rebellious, and Moses pointed out that the Israelites rebelled against the Lord constantly during those 40 years in the wilderness. Next we have the book of Joshua. The book of Joshua tells us that the Israelites crossed the Jordan River, they conquered the promised land, they lived there for a couple hundred years, and then they had a king. The first king was King Saul. And we read this about Saul. This is Samuel talking to Saul. For rebellion is as the sin of divination, and insubordination is as iniquity and idolatry. Because you have rejected the word of the Lord, he has also rejected you from being king. So this is a strong statement here about rebellion. Samuel said rebellion and insubordination is as bad as divination and iniquity and idolatry. It is a very strong statement against rebellion. After Saul, David became king. David lived roughly 1000 BC. And then over the next 500 to 600 years, there were various prophets, the major prophets and the minor prophets. One of them was Ezekiel. He lived towards the end of the Old Testament time period. And the Lord said the following to Ezekiel about the Israelites. Then he said to me, Son of man, I am sending you to the sons of Israel, to a rebellious people who have rebelled against me. They and their fathers have transgressed against me to this very day. So we see that there was this constant pattern of rebellion of the Israelites against God from the whole time from when they left Egypt up until the time of Ezekiel, which was roughly 500 BC. So the Old Testament ended approximately 400 BC, and then we have Jesus come on the scene roughly 0 AD, which is the New Testament, which ushers in what we often call the New Testament time period. Now, as you know, in the New Testament, the first 4 books are the Gospels. They tell us about the life of Jesus here on earth, which was roughly 0 AD to about 33 AD. Then we have the book of Acts, which tells us what the apostles of Jesus did after Jesus went back to heaven. That is roughly 35 AD up to about 65 AD. And during that time period, and a little bit after, the rest of the books of the New Testament were written. Most of these are letters. One of these letters was written by Paul, called Titus. And Paul wrote about rebellion in this letter. This is Titus 1, verse 10. For there are many rebellious men, empty talkers and deceivers, especially those of the circumcision. So notice the word many. Paul said there are many rebellious men. It's not just a few, there are many. Then rebellion is also mentioned in Jude. Jude also mentions specifically the rebellion of Korah. So let's take a look at Jude and see what Jude had to say about rebellion. So in Jude 3 and 4, Jude wrote why he wrote the book of Jude. He urged his readers to contend for the faith. And he did that because certain people had crept in secretly. One of the things these people were doing was they were denying our only Master and Lord, Jesus Christ. Now notice the word Master and Lord. The words Master and Lord imply authority of Jesus over others. So if these men were denying our Master and Lord Jesus Christ, that means they were rebelling against our Master, against our Lord. We see this also in Jude 8, where Jude wrote that these men who had crept into the church secretly were rejecting authority. Again, that's a different way of stating that they were rebelling against God. And then that brings us to verse 11. Woe to them, because they went in the way of Cain, they were poured out to the error of the ways of Balaam, and they were destroyed in the rebellion of Korah. Notice the word woe, that is a warning to these men. The pronoun them refers to these men who had crept into the church secretly. And the word because tells us that Jude is about to tell us why he is issuing this warning to these men. There were 3 reasons. The third one was they were destroyed in the rebellion of Korah. And we read that story in the book of Numbers. And notice the word destroyed. Korah, when he rebelled, was completely destroyed. And so this is a strong warning to these men who had crept into the church that they too are going to be destroyed. And so what we have here in Jude is a very strong statement against rebelling against God. And he used the story of Korah to point out the severity and the seriousness of rebelling against God. Let's talk a little bit about what that looks like in our culture. So Yahweh produced the Bible, and the Bible contains Yahweh's instructions. Therefore, disobeying the Bible equals rebellion against Yahweh. So in our culture, whenever there's disobedience to the Bible, that is a form of rebelling against Yahweh. Now let's look at some ways that that's happening a lot in our culture today. First of all, let's talk about the role of women. The Bible has some very clear things to say about the role of women in church. But many, if not most churches today, have women doing things that the Bible very specifically prohibits them from doing. That is a form of rebellion against Yahweh. Also, our culture is redefining marriage, and many churches are caving into that. They're refusing to take a stand. And redefining marriage is also rebellion against Yahweh because the Bible very clearly defines what marriage is. Another thing that's happening in Christianity today is we are actually in some ways redefining the church. The Bible defines church as believers gathering together to exhort and encourage one another. They are to pray for one another. They are to sharpen one another. They are to study the Bible together. But unfortunately, many churches today have redefined church as a gathering to be entertained. The music and the so-called preaching in many churches today are designed to entertain people. In the process of entertaining people, they are not sharpening people, which is one of the prime functions of the church. And so in that sense, many churches today are redefining church because they're not sharpening one another the way the Bible tells us we should be sharpening each other. So we see in the story of Korah the seriousness of rebelling against Yahweh. We see throughout the Old Testament that rebellion against Yahweh was a common problem. Paul wrote in one of his letters that there are many rebellious men. And then Jude addressed specifically these men who had crept into the church, who were denying Jesus, who were resisting authority, who were rebelling against Yahweh. And we see the seriousness of rebelling against Yahweh. And so when we look around Christianity today and we see people not obeying the Bible regarding the role of women, not obeying the Bible in regards to the definition of marriage, and not obeying the Bible in regards to the definition of church, those are things we should take very seriously because God does take rebellion very seriously. Once again, thanks for visiting Bible Mountain. If you have already joined my email list, thank you, and please forward this to someone else who would benefit from visiting Bible Mountain. If you have not joined my email list yet, please do so now. My email list is free. In order to sign up, go to BibleMountain.com, click on email, and that will take you to a web page where you can sign up. Your email address will not be sold nor given away. Once again, thanks for visiting Bible Mountain.